They formed a human wall around her in the darkness. 20 Japanese women, their bodies pressed together, trying to hide what could not be hidden. Beneath their threadbare prison clothes, beneath the layers of fabric they had wrapped around her, Haruka Tanaka's belly was swollen 6 months pregnant. If the American soldiers discovered her secret, they believed she would die, her baby would die, because that's what enemies do to each other. That's what they'd been taught. That's what they'd seen with their own eyes in the war that had just destroyed their country. But when the camp doctor walked into that examination room on a frozen Wisconsin morning in October 1945, everything these women believed about their captors, about mercy, about honor, about the true nature of their enemy, was about to shatter. This is the story of a baby born in an American prison camp, a baby delivered by enemy doctors, a baby who should never have survived but did. And the kindness that saved her would prove more dangerous than any cruelty because it would destroy everything these women thought they knew about the people they'd been taught to hate. October 14th, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The war in the Pacific had been over for exactly 2 months. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered unconditionally, and now 127 Japanese women prisoners of war captured in Manila were about to step off a military transport train into the frozen heart of America. They had traveled for 6 days, first on a prison ship from the Philippines to San Francisco, then on this train that carried them deeper and deeper into enemy territory. With each mile, their fear had grown. They were being taken inland away from the coast, away from any hope of rescue. They were being taken to a place so remote that no one would hear them scream. At least, that's what they thought. But hidden among these prisoners was a secret that would test everything America claimed to stand for. A secret that would reveal whether the Geneva Convention was just propaganda or if the enemy truly believed that even in war, human dignity could not be stripped away. That secret was Haruka Tanaka and the life growing inside her. What happened over the next 3 months would change these women forever. They would discover something more terrifying than cruelty. They would discover something that would force them to question every belief they'd held about honor, about loyalty, about who the real monsters were in this war. Because the enemy was about to do the unthinkable. They were about to show mercy. If stories like this true accounts from World War II that reveal the humanity hidden in the darkest times resonate with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These are the stories your generation lived through, the stories that needed to be remembered, and the lessons we cannot afford to forget. But first, let's go back to that frozen morning, to the moment when 127 terrified women stepped off a train and came face to face with the enemy they'd been taught would destroy them. The frost had come early to Wisconsin that year. When the train pulled into Camp McCoy at 6:47 in the morning, the temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. The women inside the third car had been awake all night, too cold and too frightened to sleep. Most of them wore thin cotton dresses issued to them in San Francisco, completely inadequate for a Wisconsin autumn. They shivered violently, their breath coming out in white clouds, their lips turning blue. But no one complained. Complaining was dangerous. Weakness was dangerous. Everything was dangerous now. Through frost-covered windows, they could see their destination. Camp McCoy stretched out before them like something from a nightmare. Rows of identical wooden barracks painted dull gray. Watchtowers rising against the pale sky. Barbed wire fences surrounding everything. Armed guards with rifles walking the perimeter. This was a prison. This was where they would die. Or so they thought. The train doors opened with a metallic shriek. Cold Wisconsin air rushed in sharp as broken glass in their lungs. American soldiers appeared at the doors, their voices loud and commanding in English. Move out. Single file. No talking. A translator, a Japanese-American soldier, repeated the orders in their language. His accent was strange, his words shaped by American vowels and consonants. He sounded like home and like enemy at the same time. Among the 127 women descending from that train were 5 who would become bound together by an impossible choice: to hide one of their own or to sacrifice her to save themselves. Emiko Sato, 28 years old, had been a nurse in Osaka before the war. She'd seen death in all its forms, on operating tables in field hospitals, in the rubble of bombed cities. She knew how to read situations, how to assess danger. And as she stepped onto that frozen platform, She knew they were walking into something none of them understood. Miyuki Yamada, 26, had worked as a secretary in Tokyo. She spoke broken English just enough to be dangerous, just enough to understand when the Americans were talking about them. She would become their reluctant translator, their bridge to a world that terrified them. Tomoe Nakamura, 30, was married to a Japanese soldier who was imprisoned somewhere in the Philippines. She received censored letters from him every few weeks, desperate notes describing starvation, disease, cruelty. She knew what happened to prisoners of war. She'd seen it in her husband's words. Sachiko Ito, 27, had lost everything in the firebombing of Tokyo. Her home, her parents, her younger brother. She had nothing left but the women around her. They had become her family. And then there was Haruka Tanaka. Haruka was 24 years old, 6 months pregnant, unmarried. The father of her baby was a Japanese soldier she'd met in Manila, a man who died in combat before she could even tell him she was carrying his child. In traditional Japanese society, her situation would have been shameful, scandalous, worthy of exile. But here in this prison camp, thousands of miles from home, shame was the least of her worries. Because if the Americans discovered her pregnancy, her friends believed one of three things would happen. The soldiers would force her to give birth alone and take the baby away. Or they would do something worse, something to end the pregnancy entirely. Or they would simply execute her because pregnant prisoners were too much trouble to deal with. No one knew which rumor was true, but they all agreed that discovery would mean disaster. For 3 months they'd hidden her. On the prison ship from Manila, they'd surrounded her during inspections, dressed her in loose clothing, positioned themselves strategically. When she had morning sickness, they'd covered the sounds with coughing. When her belly started to show, they'd wrapped her in extra layers and kept her in shadows. But now, as they marched toward the large brick building marked Camp Hospital, Haruka knew the hiding was almost over. There would be medical examinations. There always were, and this time there would be nowhere to hide. The smell hit them as they entered the building. Antiseptic soap, something sharp and medicinal. It was the smell of hospitals, the smell of places where people's fates were decided. The examination room was large and bright, with white tile floors that reflected the harsh overhead lights. 20 metal examination tables lined the walls, separated by thin white curtains that offered the illusion of privacy but provided none. A female nurse stood at the front of the room. She was young, maybe 34, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her uniform was crisp, spotless. Her face was professional, neither kind nor cruel, just efficient. Through the translator, a Japanese-American officer named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the nurse, gave instructions. Please remove your outer clothing and stand by the examination tables. The women were divided into groups of 5. Haruka's group had been carefully orchestrated. She was surrounded by her protectors, Emiko, Mayuki, Tomoe, and Sachiko. They traded positions with other women on the train to make sure they'd stay together. Now they stood in a tight cluster, trying to shield Haruka for just a few more minutes. Slowly, the women began to undress. Their fingers fumbled with buttons, with ties, with the thin fabric that was all they had between themselves and complete vulnerability. Haruka removed her outer dress, revealing the loose undershirt beneath, made of thin cotton, intentionally baggy, hanging over her belly in a way that might hide her pregnancy if no one looked too closely. But someone was looking closely. Nurse Margaret Sullivan, her name tag read. Sullivan had paused in her work with another group. Her eyes had landed on Haruka. They traveled from Haruka's face down to her midsection and then back up again. Emiko saw the exact moment when Nurse Sullivan realized what she was seeing. The woman's eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly. She set down her clipboard and started walking toward them. Emiko stepped between the nurse and Haruka. Her English was broken, but her voice was steady. Wait. Please wait. Step aside, Nurse Sullivan replied, not unkindly but firmly. I need to examine her. She is fine, Emiko insisted, her English breaking down under stress. She is healthy. No sick. No problem. Ma'am, I need you to step aside. Nurse Sullivan's voice was louder now, attracting attention from across the room. Other nurses paused in their work. A male doctor at the far end of the room, gray-haired with glasses and a white coat, looked up from his clipboard and started walking toward them. Miyuki and Tomoe moved closer to Haruka, forming a tighter circle. It was instinctive, protective, and completely futile. The American nurse raised her hand and beckoned to the approaching doctor. Dr. Hayes, she said quietly, I need you here. And that's when everything changed, because Dr. William Hayes was about to do something these women never expected. He was about to keep a promise they didn't know America had made. Dr. William Hayes was 52 years old. He had gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that looked perpetually tired. The face of a man who'd seen too much suffering and had decided somewhere along the way that he would not contribute to it if he could help it. He approached the cluster of Japanese women calmly, his hands in the pockets of his white coat. What's the problem? He asked Nurse Sullivan, though his eyes were on the women who looked like they were preparing for battle. I think this one might be pregnant, Sullivan said quietly. But in the silent room, everyone heard. Pregnant. The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. The other women in the room turned to look. The American staff members exchanged glances. And Haruka's friends, her makeshift family, tightened their circle, their faces set with determination and terror. Dr. Hayes stepped forward. Ladies, he said through the translator, I need to examine her. It's important for her health and the baby's health. We can't help if we don't know what's going on. Emiko understood enough of this to grasp the meaning, and she asked the question that had been burning in all their minds. You take baby, you hurt baby. Dr. Hayes' eyebrows rose in surprise. And this was the moment that would begin to crack the foundation of everything they believed. His face softened with understanding. No, he said slowly and clearly, making sure the translator conveyed every word. No, we protect baby. We help, I promise. Promises from the enemy meant nothing. They'd been promised safety before and found only bombs. They'd been promised honor and found only defeat. Why would this promise be any different? Tomo began to cry. Miyuki was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Sachiko had her arms around Haruka's shoulders, holding on as if she could physically prevent what was about to happen. And Haruka, silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. Let him see. There's nowhere left to hide. Her friends looked at her with anguish, but they knew she was right. Slowly, reluctantly, they stepped back. Haruka stood alone, vulnerable, her hand pressed protectively against her belly. May I, Dr. Hayes asked, gesturing toward her. Haruka didn't understand the English words, but she understood the gesture. She nodded once. He lifted the edge of her undershirt, and there was no hiding it anymore. Her belly was round and full, unmistakably pregnant. The baby kicked visible, even from the outside, and Dr. Hayes' face broke into a smile. Well, he said softly, looking at Haruka's belly with something that looked almost like wonder. Hello there. What happened next was not what any of these women expected. Dr. Hayes didn't call for guards. He didn't shout orders. He didn't reach for any instruments or syringes. Instead, he turned to Nurse Sullivan and said, Get her a chair and a blanket. She shouldn't be standing this long. The nurse hurried away and returned with a chair and a thick wool blanket. Dr. Hayes gestured for Haruka to sit. When she hesitated, he spoke through the translator. Please, you need to take care of yourself. When is the baby due? Haruka stared at him. She didn't answer. She couldn't process what was happening. He was asking when the baby was due, as if this were a normal situation, as if she were a patient at a regular hospital instead of an enemy prisoner about to be punished. How many months? Dr. Hayes tried again, holding up fingers. 4, 5, 6. Emiko, still standing protectively nearby, held up 6 fingers. 6 months, she said in English. 6 months, Dr. Hayes repeated, making a note on his clipboard. Okay, that means we have about 3 months to prepare. He pointed to Emiko. Are you a nurse? Emiko blinked, caught off guard. Yes, I was nurse in Osaka, good Dr. Hayes said. You'll help me monitor her pregnancy. I need to know immediately if there are any problems. Bleeding, severe pain, anything unusual. He was speaking faster now, slipping back into his normal professional pace. Another American doctor had joined them, younger man with red hair and freckles. Is she really pregnant? The younger doctor asked. About 6 months along, Dr. Hayes confirmed. Looks healthy, but we need to do a proper examination. Get her file ready. We'll need to track her nutrition carefully. She'll need extra rations, vitamin supplements, regular checkups. The red-haired doctor looked confused. Do we even have protocols for this? I mean, for a pregnant prisoner of war? Dr. Hayes' voice was firm. We'll follow the same protocols we'd use for any pregnant woman. She's entitled to proper medical care under the Geneva Convention. Get it set up. The women watching this exchange couldn't follow all the English words, but they understood the tone. The American doctors weren't angry. They weren't threatening. They were acting like doctors, talking about vitamins, checkups, making sure the baby was healthy. Tomoe grabbed the translator's arm. What are they saying? Are they taking the baby? Are they hurting her? Lieutenant Chen shook her head. No, they're saying they will take care of her, give her extra food, make sure the baby is healthy. Why, Miyuki demanded. Why would they do that? We're prisoners. We're enemies. The translator hesitated. Then she said slowly, because that's what doctors do. They take care of people, even enemies. But this made no sense to the women. In their experience, enemies didn't take care of each other. What these women were about to discover, what would haunt them and heal them and force them to question everything they had ever been taught, was that the cruelty they had expected never came. Instead, something far more dangerous arrived: kindness. And kindness from your enemy is the most terrifying weapon of all. Because once you accept it, you can never go back to hating them the way you did before. Dr. Hayes conducted the examination with professional care. He measured Haruka's belly with a cloth tape measure, explaining each step through the translator. He listened to the baby's heartbeat with a stethoscope, and his face broke into another smile when he heard the strong, rapid thump, thump, thump. Healthy, he announced. Very healthy. Strong heartbeat. He checked Haruka's blood pressure, looked at her ankles for swelling, asked questions about her diet, her symptoms, whether she'd had any bleeding or pain. And Miko, using her nursing knowledge in broken English, helped translate the more technical questions. And then she admitted something that had been weighing on her. Her diet has been very poor. On the ship, very little food. Rice, sometimes fish, not enough. She is always hungry. Dr. Hayes' expression darkened. That needs to change immediately, he said. She needs protein, vegetables, dairy. Growing a baby takes a lot of resources. He made more notes. I'm prescribing daily vitamin supplements in extra meal portions. She should eat 4 times a day, if possible. And plenty of water. He stood up and looked at the group of women who had remained clustered around Haruka throughout the entire examination. You all care about her very much, he observed. That's good. She needs support. Pregnancy can be difficult, especially under these circumstances. Circumstances? Emiko repeated, unsure of the word. This situation, Lieutenant Chen clarified. Being a prisoner, being far from home. It's stressful, Sachiko asked suddenly the question that had been haunting all of them. Will the baby be taken away? When it's born, will you take it? The translator relayed the question to Dr. Hayes. His face grew serious. I don't know what will happen after the birth, he admitted. That's not my decision to make. But while she's here, while she's under my care, I will do everything I can to make sure both mother and baby are healthy and safe. That's my job. That's what I'm trained to do. It was an honest answer, which somehow made it worse. He couldn't promise that Haruka could keep her baby. He couldn't promise anything about the future. But he could promise care in the present. And strange as it was, they found themselves believing him. After the examination, Haruka was given a separate bunk in a corner of the barracks, chosen specifically because it was away from drafts and close to the wood stove. She was given 2 extra blankets and a pillow, luxuries that the other women didn't have. She was given a package of vitamins and instructions to take one every morning. That evening, during their first meal in the camp mess hall, Haruka's tray had portions noticeably larger than everyone else's. Extra meat, an extra roll, a bowl of milk instead of just water. The other prisoners stared, some with envy, others with confusion. Why are they feeding her so much, one woman whispered. Because she's pregnant, another replied. Because they want the baby healthy. But why? Why do they care about a Japanese baby? No one had an answer. It defied everything they knew about war, about enemies, about how prisoners were treated. In the Japan they came from, resources were scarce, and only the valuable received extra. A pregnant prisoner was a burden, not someone deserving of care. But here in this American prison camp, their pregnant friend was being given extra food, extra blankets, and regular medical attention. She was being treated like someone whose life mattered, like someone worth protecting. That night, in the darkness of the barracks, the women gathered around Haruka's bunk and spoke in whispers. I don't understand, Miyuki said. Are they being kind because they're good people, or is there some other reason? Does it matter? Tomoe replied. She's getting help. The baby has a chance. Isn't that what we wanted? Yes, Emiko said quietly. But accepting their help feels like betrayal, like we're accepting that they're right and we're wrong, like we're admitting defeat not just in war but in everything we believed. And there it was. The real terror wasn't that the Americans would be cruel. The real terror was that they were being kind. And kindness from the enemy meant that everything they had been taught was a lie. Within a week, Haruka's pregnancy had become an open fact throughout the camp. The American guards knew. The other prisoners knew. Even the camp commander knew. And astonishingly, no one punished her for it. Every morning at 7 o'clock after breakfast, Haruka reported to the camp hospital. Dr. Hayes or one of the other medical staff would check her vital signs, measure her belly's growth, ask about any discomfort. Emiko always accompanied her both as translator and as medical consultant. Hayes had started teaching Emiko more advanced English medical terms, and she soaked up the knowledge like water after a drought. Contraction, he'd say, demonstrating with his hands. Emiko would repeat memorizing. Dilation, breech position, placenta. She was learning the language of childbirth in English, preparing for a delivery that might save her friend's life. The daily routine had settled into an unexpected rhythm. Work assignments, though steady, weren't brutal. Haruka folded laundry in the warm laundry room, sorted supplies in the warehouse. Tasks that didn't require heavy lifting or long periods of standing. The other women had regular work assignments, too. Some worked in the kitchens, others did general maintenance around the camp. A few with education like Miyuki worked as translators or teachers helping American soldiers learn basic Japanese phrases. And that's how they met Private Daniel O'Connor. Danny was 19 years old, red hair, freckles. Homesick as hell. He was the youngest guard at Camp McCoy, and he'd volunteered to learn Japanese because he was curious about the prisoners. Because unlike some of the other soldiers, he didn't see enemies when he looked at them. He saw people, scared people, far from home, just like him. His Japanese was terrible. Ohayo gozaimasu, he'd say every morning, bowing awkwardly. Good morning. The women would try not to laugh. His accent was so bad it sounded like he was saying, Ohio goes my mouse. But his effort was genuine. And somehow that mattered more than accuracy. 3 weeks after Haruka's pregnancy was discovered, Danny showed up at the barracks with a package wrapped in brown paper. For your friend, he said in broken Japanese, pointing at Haruka. For baby. Inside were things that made the women cry. Baby clothes. Tiny, hand-knitted, soft as clouds. Little socks no bigger than a thumb. A blanket white with yellow trim. And a note written in careful handwriting. Lieutenant Chen translated the note. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the barracks. Dear Mother, my name is Margaret O'Connor. My son Danny told me about you. I made these for my daughter's baby, but she's not due until spring. Please take them for your little one. I'm praying for you both. May God bless you and keep you safe. Margaret O'Connor, Boston, Massachusetts. An American grandmother who'd never met Haruka, who had no reason to care about a Japanese baby, had spent hours knitting clothes for an enemy's child. Why, Haruka whispered, holding the tiny socks. Why would she do this? Danny, who understood just enough Japanese to catch the question, smiled. Because he said simply, that's what grandmothers do. The camp had a canteen where prisoners could buy items with script they earned from working. Chocolate bars, soap, writing paper, small luxuries. Haruka used her script to buy chocolate. Extra calories for the baby, the doctor had said. But she always shared it with her friends. They would sit in the barracks in the evenings, slowly eating their chocolate, trying not to think about families back home who had nothing. Miyuki had received a letter from her mother in Hiroshima. The city was gone, reduced to ash. Survivors were living in makeshift shelters, eating whatever they could find. Grass bark insects when they were lucky. She read the letter once, then hid it away. She couldn't bear to read it again while eating 3 meals a day in an American prison camp. The guilt was crushing. How do we live with this? Sachiko asked one night, chocolate melting in her hand. How do we accept kindness from them while our families starve? No one had an answer because the truth was simple and terrible. Accepting the enemy's mercy felt like the deepest betrayal of all. The conversations in the barracks grew more honest, more painful. The women had stopped pretending they understood what was happening. Now they were wrestling with what it meant for their identity, their loyalty, their future. One night, about 6 weeks after arriving at Camp McCoy, they gathered around Haruka's bunk and spoke the truths they'd been afraid to voice. Sachiko started. I feel like I'm betraying everyone back home. My parents are starving in Osaka. My little sister died last year because there was no medicine. And here I am, healthy, fed, warm, being cared for by the people who bombed our cities. But you didn't choose to be here, Emiko pointed out. You didn't ask for this treatment. It's being given to you because of their beliefs, not because you deserve it more than the people suffering at home. That's the point, though, Miyuki said. They believe everyone deserves it. That's what Dr. Hayes told me yesterday. He said every human being deserves basic care and dignity, regardless of what country they're from or what they've done. That's not how we were raised to think. Tomoe nodded slowly. Because we were raised to value the collective over the individual. The group matters more than the person. The nation matters more than the citizen. But here they act like each person matters individually. Like Haruka matters as Haruka, not as a Japanese prisoner or a tool for the state. Fumiko Hayashi, 35 years old, one of the older women and the most resistant to accepting American kindness, challenged them. And you think that's better? Her voice was sharp. This individualism, this self-centeredness, that's what makes them weak. That's what makes them soft. Miyuki looked at her steadily. They won the war. Fumiko, they dropped atomic bombs that ended the fighting in minutes. They built weapons and planes and ships that overwhelmed us completely. Does that seem soft to you? Fumiko had no response. The evidence was undeniable. America had crushed Japan militarily while simultaneously maintaining enough resources and organization to treat prisoners well. They had the strength to destroy and the discipline to show mercy. That combination was more frightening than simple cruelty would have been. Haruka spoke up, her voice heavy with the weight of her pregnancy and her thoughts. I've been thinking about what I'll tell my child about this time. And I realized I can't lie to them. I can't tell them that Americans were monsters because it wouldn't be true. I can't tell them that Japan was always right because that's not true either. All I can tell them is what happened, that in the darkest time of my life, when I thought I would die and my baby would die, our enemies chose to help us. And that kindness changed something fundamental in how I see the world. Fumiko's response was bitter. But at what cost, Haruka? You're changing your worldview to match theirs. You're letting them remake you. No, Haruka said firmly, placing her hand on her belly where the baby was moving. They're not remaking me. They're showing me that there's more than one way to see the world, more than one way to be strong, more than one definition of honor. Back home, I would have been shamed for this pregnancy, disgraced, possibly disowned. Here they're protecting me. Which system values human life more? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind against the barracks walls. And then Tomoe spoke, pulling out a letter she'd received that day from her husband in the Philippines. He describes his camp, she said quietly. Overcrowded, disease-ridden, barely enough food to survive. He's lost 40 pounds. Men are dying daily. The guards are harsh. The work is brutal. She paused, her voice breaking. And then he writes, I hope you are suffering less than we are. I hope the Americans are treating you according to the Geneva Convention as they claim to do. She looked up at her friends, tears streaming down her face. He hopes our enemies are showing us mercy, and they are. They're feeding us, they're keeping us healthy, they're helping Haruka's baby while our own soldiers starve in their camps. How do we live with that? How do we reconcile that our enemy is more humane than our own side? There was no answer, because the truth was too painful to fully accept. That everything they'd been taught about honor, about loyalty, about the proper treatment of prisoners had been a lie. And the enemy, the Americans they'd been taught to hate and fear, were showing them a different way. A way where even your enemy deserved dignity. Where even a prisoner's baby mattered. Where humanity could exist in the midst of hatred. But accepting that truth meant betraying everything they'd believed in. And the women of Camp McCoy weren't ready for that. Not yet. First, they would have to face an even greater test, a medical crisis that would force the Americans to prove whether their mercy was real or just another form of propaganda. While Haruka and her friends were wrestling with the unbearable kindness of their captors, Another struggle was happening in the administrative offices of Camp McCoy. Captain Richard Brennan, 45 years old, commander of the prisoner of war facility, sat across from Dr. William Hayes in an office that smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and old paper. Brennan was a man who lived by regulations, by the book, by clear chains of command. And right now, a pregnant Japanese prisoner was threatening to complicate everything. Dr. Brennan said, tapping his pen on the desk, "I respect your medical expertise, but this is a prisoner of war camp, not a maternity ward. If other camps here were giving special treatment to a pregnant prisoner, it sets a dangerous precedent." Dr. Hayes leaned back in his chair. He'd had this conversation before. Different wars, different commanders, same fundamental question. Where do you draw the line between security and humanity? With all due respect, Captain Hayes replied, his voice calm but firm. The Geneva Convention is clear. Prisoners of war are entitled to adequate medical care. Pregnancy is a medical condition that requires special attention. We're not doing her a favor. We're following international law. I understand that, Brennan said. But extra rations, private quarters, daily checkups. This goes beyond adequate care. The other prisoners are noticing. They're starting to ask questions. Are they complaining? No, Brennan admitted. They're confused. Some are grateful. Others are suspicious. They don't know what to make of it. Dr. Hayes nodded. That's because they've been taught that prisoners are treated like animals. We're showing them something different. Maybe that's exactly what they need to see. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who'd been standing by the door, spoke up. She was the translator, the bridge between two worlds, and she understood both sides better than anyone. Sir, she said carefully, if I may, the Japanese women see this as a test. They've been taught that Americans are barbaric, that we're devils who torture prisoners for sport. If we prove them wrong, we might change more than just this camp. We might change how they see us as a nation. Brennan looked at her, then back at Dr. Hayes. He was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up a telegram that had arrived that morning and slid it across the desk. I received this from command, he said. They want regular reports on this special situation. And if there are any complications, any at all, they've ordered that the prisoner be transferred to the military hospital in Chicago. Dr. Hayes' expression hardened. That would be catastrophic for her mental health. She needs her support system. The women who have been protecting her. Transferring her would... Orders are orders, Dr. Brennan interrupted. Let's just hope there are no complications. What neither man knew, what no one could have predicted, was that complications were coming. And when they did, Captain Richard Brennan would have to choose between following orders and doing what he believed was right. But that choice was still weeks away. First, the women of Camp McCoy had to face something even more unsettling than medical examinations and Geneva Convention protocols. They had to face normalcy, daily life, the strange, disorienting experience of being treated like human beings by the people they had been taught to hate. If you're finding this story as powerful as I am, if you served during this era, or if your father or grandfather did, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. What was it like for Americans dealing with enemy prisoners? Did you ever encounter former prisoners of war after the war? Share your memories below. These stories matter. They're part of our history, and make sure you're subscribed because what happens next, the slow, painful process of these women realizing that everything they believed was wrong, is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Within a week, Haruka's pregnancy had become common knowledge throughout the camp. The American guards knew. The other prisoners knew. Even Captain Brennan knew. And astonishingly, no one punished her for it. In fact, something stranger was happening. The camp was beginning to care. Every morning at 7 o'clock after breakfast, Haruka reported to the camp hospital. Dr. Hayes or one of the other medical staff would check her vital signs, measure her belly's growth, ask about any discomfort. Emiko always accompanied her both as translator and as medical consultant. Dr. Hayes had started teaching Emiko more advanced English medical terms, and she soaked up the knowledge like someone who'd been thirsty for years. Contraction, he'd say, demonstrating with his hands. Code that Emiko would repeat memorizing. Dilation, breech position, placenta. She was learning the language of childbirth in English, preparing for a delivery that might save her friend's life. Because hanging over everything was that telegram in Captain Brennan's office. Any complications transferred to Chicago, which meant any problem at all, and Haruka would be separated from everyone she knew. From Emiko, who understood her. from her friends who'd protected her, from the fragile safety net they'd built together. The women didn't talk about that possibility, but they all thought about it. Every day, every checkup, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The daily routine had settled into an unexpected rhythm. Work assignments, though steady, weren't brutal. Haruka folded laundry in the warm laundry room, sorted supplies in the warehouse. Tasks that didn't require heavy lifting or long periods of standing. The other women had regular work assignments too. Some worked in the kitchens, others did general maintenance around the camp. A few with education like Miyuki worked as translators or teachers helping American soldiers learn basic Japanese phrases. And that's how Private Daniel O'Connor became part of their daily lives. Danny was 19 years old, red hair, freckles, homesick in a way that made him ache for his mother's kitchen in Boston. He was the youngest guard at Camp McCoy, and he'd volunteered to learn Japanese not because it would help his career, but because he was genuinely curious about these women. Because unlike some of the other soldiers, he didn't see enemies when he looked at them. He saw people, scared people, far from home, just like him. His Japanese was terrible. "Ohayo gozaimasu," he'd say every morning, bowing so awkwardly it looked like he was checking his boots for mud. "Good morning." The women would hide their smiles behind their hands. His accent was so mangled it sounded like he was saying, "Ohio goes my mouse." But his effort was genuine, and in a place where everything felt dangerous and uncertain, that genuineness was a small miracle. Danny's vocabulary grew slowly. "Arigato," thank you. "Genki desu ka," how are you? "O tenki," weather. Simple words, simple phrases, but spoken with such earnest concentration that the women found themselves looking forward to his daily attempts. 3 weeks after Haruka's pregnancy was discovered, Danny showed up at the barracks after evening meal and with a package wrapped in brown paper. His face was red, not from cold, but from nervousness. "For your friend," he said in broken Japanese, pointing at Haruka. "For baby." The women gathered around as Haruka unwrapped the package with trembling hands. Inside were things that made breathing difficult. Baby clothes, impossibly tiny, hand-knitted with such care that you could see love in every stitch, soft as clouds, delicate as prayer. Little socks no bigger than Haruka's thumb, a blanket white with yellow and pink trim, the edges scalloped with such precision that it must have taken weeks to complete, and a note written in careful handwriting on cream-colored paper. Lieutenant Chen was called to translate. She read slowly, her own voice catching. "Dear Mother, my name is Margaret O'Connor. My son Danny told me about you. I made these for my daughter's baby, but she's not due until spring. Please take them for your little one. I've been praying for you every night since Danny wrote to me. I hope your baby is healthy. I hope you are strong. When you wrap your child in this blanket, know that an American grandmother across the ocean is sending you love. May God bless you and keep you safe. Margaret O'Connor, Boston, Massachusetts." By the time Lieutenant Chen finished, every woman in the barracks was crying. Even Fumiko, who'd been the most resistant to accepting American kindness, had tears running down her weathered face. An American grandmother, who'd never met Haruka, whose son wore the uniform of the enemy, who had every reason to hate Japanese women, had spent hours, days, weeks knitting clothes for a baby she would never see. Why, Haruka whispered, clutching the tiny socks to her chest. Why would she do this? Danny, who understood just enough Japanese to catch the question, smiled. It was a shy smile, young and uncertain, but real. Because he said in English, then struggled for the Japanese words. Because grandmothers love babies. All babies, Lieutenant Chen translated, and something shifted in the room. Some wall that had been holding some final resistance began to crack. Because it was one thing to accept that American doctors were following rules, that they were obeying the Geneva Convention, that they were doing their duty. But this was different. This was a woman in Boston, a mother who'd lived through Pearl Harbor, who'd sent her son to war, who had every right to hate, choosing to spend her evenings knitting for an enemy's baby. Not because anyone ordered her to, not because it would help America win anything, but because somewhere in her heart she decided that an enemy's baby was still a baby, still deserving of warmth, still worthy of love. That night the women sat around Haruka's bunk, passing the tiny clothes from hand to hand, marveling at the stitches, at the softness, at the impossible kindness woven into every thread. "I don't know what to feel anymore," Miyuki said quietly. Every time I think I understand something like this happens. Tomoe folded and refolded a tiny shirt, her fingers tracing the delicate buttons. My husband wrote that in his camp, the guards take their food rations for themselves, leave the prisoners with barely enough to survive. And here we have an American woman knitting clothes for Haruka's baby. Sachiko wiped her eyes. What do we do with this? How do we carry this home? That's what I've been wondering, Emiko said. When we return to Japan, when we tell people about this place, who will believe us? Who will believe that enemy soldiers were kind, that enemy doctors cared, that an enemy grandmother made clothes for a Japanese baby? They'll say we're lying, Fumiko said, her voice flat. They'll say we've been brainwashed, that we've forgotten our honor. But we haven't. Haruka said firmly, one hand on her belly, the other holding Mrs. O'Connor's blanket. We've just learned that honor is more complicated than we were taught, that the enemy can be honorable too, that kindness doesn't require you to abandon your country. It just requires you to remember that your enemy is human. The camp had a canteen where prisoners could buy items with scrip they earned from working. It was a small building near the mess hall, and inside were things that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, real chocolate, not the ersatz substitutes they'd had in Japan for years. Soap that smelled like flowers, writing paper, pencils, combs, ribbons. Haruka used her scrip to buy chocolate. The doctor says the baby needs sugar for energy, she explained. But everyone knew she bought it so she could share it with her friends. They would sit in the barracks in the evening after work, slowly eating their chocolate, trying to make it last, trying not to think about families back home who hadn't seen chocolate in years, who were eating whatever they could find to survive. Miyuki had received another letter from her mother in Hiroshima. This one was shorter, the handwriting shaky. We are surviving, her mother had written. There is American aid now, food distributions, medicine. The occupation soldiers are not as cruel as we feared, but it is still very hard. The city is still ruins. We still have so little. Your father asks about you every day. He wants to know if you are safe, if you are being treated well. I tell him I don't know. I tell him I pray for you. Please come home soon. We need you. Miyuki read the letter once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small box where she kept her few possessions. She couldn't bring herself to write back. What would she say, that she was eating chocolate in an American prison camp while her parents scavenged for food in the ruins of Hiroshima? The guilt was crushing, suffocating. Every meal felt like a betrayal. Every warm blanket, every kind word from a guard, every moment of not suffering felt like abandoning her family. How do we live with this? Sachiko asked one night, chocolate melting on her tongue. How do we accept kindness from them while our families starve? Emiko had been thinking about this question for weeks, turning it over in her mind during the long hours of work, during the quiet moments before sleep. I think she said slowly that we live with it by remembering that we didn't choose this. We didn't ask to be captured. We didn't ask to be brought here. We didn't ask for kindness. It was given to us. And maybe she continued, her voice growing stronger. Maybe the guilt we feel is exactly right. Maybe it should hurt to be treated well while others suffer. Maybe that pain is what keeps us human, what keeps us from forgetting. But that doesn't mean we refuse the kindness, because refusing it won't feed our families. It won't change anything except making ourselves suffer more. And what purpose does that serve? Tomoe nodded slowly. My husband wrote in his last letter, survive. That was his only request. Not be strong, not be brave, just survive. Because if we survive, we can go home. We can rebuild. We can tell our stories. And maybe, Miyuki added quietly, maybe our stories will change something. Maybe when we tell people that enemies showed us mercy, some of them will listen. Some of them will start to question the hatred. Fumiko snorted. Most will call us traitors. Maybe, Haruka said, cradling her belly where the baby was moving active tonight, restless. But I'd rather be called a traitor for telling the truth than be honored for perpetuating a lie. Early December arrived with bitter cold. Haruka was 8 months pregnant, now her belly large and heavy. Every movement was difficult. Every night was uncomfortable. But the baby was active, healthy, strong. And then one morning during her regular checkup, Dr. Hayes frowned. He placed his hands on Haruka's abdomen, pressing gently here then there. His expression grew more concerned. He felt again more carefully this time, mapping the baby's position with practiced fingers. Amiko, he said, his voice serious. I need you to understand this carefully. Through Lieutenant Chen, he explained. The baby is in breech position. That means it's sitting bottom down instead of head down. Right now, at 8 months, this is concerning. If the baby doesn't turn by month 9, we'll have 3 options, all of them risky. He ticked them off on his fingers. We can try to turn the baby manually, which is painful and sometimes dangerous. We can attempt a breech delivery, which poses significant risks to both mother and child. Or we perform a cesarean section surgery, which is even more dangerous without proper equipment. Amiko translated, her voice shaking. She remembered a breech birth she'd witnessed in Osaka. A young woman, barely 20. The baby had gotten stuck during delivery. They'd tried everything, but there was no equipment, no expertise, just desperation and prayer. The mother had bled to death. The baby had died too oxygen-deprived, its skull compressed from the prolonged labor. Amiko had held the dead baby in her arms afterward, looking at its purple face and sworn she would never feel so helpless again. Dangerous, Haruka asked in Japanese, her hand instinctively covering her belly. It can be, Dr. Hayes admitted through the translator. But we have time. Many babies turn on their own in the next few weeks. And if not, we're prepared. I've delivered breech babies before. It's risky, but manageable. We have the tools, the experience. You'll be in good hands. He paused, then added, and Amiko will be with you, every step. You won't be alone. That night, Haruka lay in her bunk, hands on her belly, talking to the baby in whispers. Please turn, little one, please. I know you're comfortable where you are, but you need to move. You need to be ready, because we're going to meet soon, and I want you to be safe. I want us both to be safe, Ma. Turn for me. Please turn. The baby kicked in a response, a strong thump against her ribs. 2 weeks later, December 3rd, Haruka woke before dawn with a splitting headache. The pain was so intense it made her nauseous black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. She tried to sit up, but the room spun. Her hands were swollen tight and painful. Her feet, too, when she looked down, barely recognizable. Amiko, she called weakly. Something's wrong. Amiko was awake immediately, years of nursing training kicking in. She took one look at Haruka, at her swollen extremities, at the way she was holding her head, and her blood went cold. She'd seen this before. Preeclampsia, high blood pressure during pregnancy, a condition that could kill mother and baby within hours if left untreated. Stay here, she commanded, already pulling on her clothes. Don't move, I'm getting Dr. Hayes. She ran through the pre-dawn darkness, her breath coming in white clouds, her feet pounding on frozen ground. The hospital was locked, but she pounded on the door until a night nurse opened it. Dr. Hayes, Amiko gasped. Come now, Haruka, something wrong, very wrong. Within 10 minutes, Haruka was in the hospital. Dr. Hayes took her blood pressure, and his face went pale. 160 over 110, dangerously high, life-threateningly high. This is preeclampsia, he said grimly. Severe preeclampsia. If it gets worse, if we don't get her blood pressure down, she could have seizures, organ failure, death for both mother and baby. She needs to be admitted immediately. He turned to Nurse Sullivan. Get her into bed. Start magnesium sulfate. Monitor blood pressure every hour. And someone call Captain Brennan. He needs to know. The next 3 days were a nightmare of waiting. Haruka lay in the hospital bed, connected to monitoring equipment, receiving medications to lower her blood pressure and prevent seizures. Imiko, Miyuki, Tomoe, and Sachiko refused to leave her side. They took shifts staying with her around the clock, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, praying in Japanese to gods they weren't sure were listening anymore. Dr. Hayes and Nurse Sullivan worked through the nights, checking Haruka's blood pressure every 2 hours, adjusting medications, watching for any sign that her condition was worsening. For 3 days, Haruka balanced on a knife's edge between life and death, and then Captain Brennan appeared in the hospital room. He stood at the foot of Haruka's bed looking at her. Young, frightened, swollen from the preeclampsia, her hand protectively over her belly, even in her medicated half-sleep. Doctor, he said quietly, I've received orders from command. If her condition worsens, any sign of seizure or organ failure, I'm to transfer her immediately to the military hospital in Chicago. They have better equipment. Specialists. Dr. Hayes looked up from his clipboard, his face exhausted from 3 days of minimal sleep. Captain, moving her now could trigger exactly what we're trying to prevent. The stress of transport being separated from her support system, it could cause a seizure. She's stable here, improving even. If we can get through the next 48 hours, that's not your call to make, Dr. Brennan interrupted. I have orders, then disobey them. The room went silent. Even the women who didn't fully understand the English sensed the confrontation. Excuse me, Brennan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Dr. Hayes stood up facing the commander. Disobey them, Captain. Make the call that saves her life. Make the call that proves everything we claim to believe about human dignity and the Geneva Convention. Make the call you can be proud of. Brennan looked at Haruka, really looked at her, young, vulnerable, her belly swollen with life, fighting for survival in a foreign country surrounded by enemies who'd become something else, something complicated. He thought about his own wife, 20 years ago, pregnant with their first child, pre-eclampsia. He'd sat by her bedside for 4 days, terrified he'd lose her, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. His wife had survived. Their daughter had survived. She was 20 now, married, living in California. But he'd never forgotten that fear, that helplessness, that desperate primal need to protect the person you love from something you can't fight. All right, Brennan said finally, she stays. But if anything goes wrong, anything at all, it's on both of us. I can live with that, Dar Hayes replied. And something shifted in that moment. Captain Richard Brennan, who'd lived his entire military career by the book, by regulations, by clear chains of command, had just chosen mercy over orders, had chosen one woman's life over his career. Because somewhere along the way, watching Dr. Hayes fight for this Japanese prisoner, watching the women care for each other with such fierce devotion, watching a baby grow inside an enemy, he'd started to see her differently. Not as a prisoner of war number, not as a security concern, not as a complication in his reports, as a person, a mother, a human being who deserved a chance. Maybe, just maybe, that's what America was really about. 3 days later, Haruka's blood pressure dropped to 140/90, still high but stable. The immediate crisis had passed. Dr. Hayes allowed himself to smile for the first time in 72 hours. You're going to be all right, he told Haruka through Lieutenant Chen. You and your baby, you're both fighters. But the baby was still breech, still sitting bottom down, waiting to be born in the most dangerous position possible. And in 7 days, December 10th, Dr. Hayes would attempt something risky, painful, and potentially dangerous. He would try to turn the baby manually from outside Haruka's belly. External cephalic version, the medical term, a procedure that could save both their lives or cause complications that would end them. But there was no other choice, not if they wanted to give Haruka a chance at a safe delivery. That night, back in the barracks, after being released from the hospital, Haruka lay in her bunk hands on her still swollen belly and thought about Captain Brennan. He'd broken orders to keep her here, risked his career. For a Japanese prisoner, he didn't know. Why? Because we're all human, Emiko said quietly when Haruka asked. Because when you strip away the uniforms and the flags and the propaganda, we're all just people, trying to survive, trying to do right, trying to show mercy when we can. And maybe, she added, maybe that's what separates civilization from barbarism. Not that civilized people don't fight wars, but that even in war, they remember their enemy is human too. Haruka closed her eyes, feeling the baby move inside her. Strong kicks, determined, a fighter just like Dr. Hayes had said. Please turn, she whispered again. Please be ready, because they're going to help us. These enemies who aren't really enemies anymore. They're going to help us survive. And I need you to help too. Turn for me, little one. Please turn. December 10th, 1945, the procedure room was warm, almost uncomfortably so. They turned up the heat because Haruka needed to be relaxed, her muscles loose for what Dr. Hayes was about to attempt. External cephalic version. The medical term sounded clinical, detached, but there was nothing detached about what was going to happen. Dr. Hayes was going to try to turn a breech baby from outside the mother's belly. He was going to use his hands, his experience, and a kind of practiced intuition to rotate a living child inside the womb, convincing it to move into the correct position for birth. It sounded simple. It wasn't. Haruka lay on the examination table, her abdomen exposed, glistening with oil that Dr. Hayes had applied to help his hands move smoothly across her skin. Her face was pale, her jaw clenched with anticipation of pain. Dr. Hayes stood beside her, his hands already positioning on her belly, feeling for the baby's head, the baby's bottom mapping the terrain of life beneath skin and muscle. Nurse Sullivan was at the monitoring equipment watching the baby's heartbeat. 145 beats per minute. Strong, steady, for now. Dr. Collins, the younger doctor with red hair, stood ready with instruments in case something went wrong. In case the procedure caused the placenta to detach, or the umbilical cord to compress, or any of a dozen other complications that could kill mother and baby within minutes. And Emiko held Haruka's hand, whispering in Japanese, "Breathe, just breathe, you're strong. You've survived war. You've survived starvation. You've survived preeclampsia. You can survive this." Outside the door, Miyuki, Tomoe, and Sachiko waited. They weren't allowed in for the procedure. Too many people, Dr. Hayes had said, but they refused to leave the hallway. They sat on the floor, backs against the wall, hands clasped together, praying to ancestors and Boishas and whatever forces governed mercy. Even Fumiko was there, silent but present. Inside the room, Dr. Hayes placed his hands firmly on Haruka's belly. "This is going to hurt," he said through Lieutenant Chen. "I'm sorry, but it's necessary." Haruka nodded, her hand gripping Emiko's so tightly that both their knuckles turned white. Dr. Hayes began to push, gently at first, then with increasing pressure. He was trying to rotate the baby inside the womb, turning it like a key in a lock. Clockwise, slowly, carefully, feeling for resistance, for the baby's cooperation, for any sign that this was working, or that he needed to stop before something tore, something broke, something ended. Haruka cried out. The pain was intense, unlike anything she'd experienced. A deep, strange pressure that felt like her body was being torn apart from the inside. Like someone was rearranging her organs, pushing and pulling and forcing things to move that were meant to stay still. "Breathe," Emiko commanded, her own voice shaking. "Breathe through it. In and out. In and out." "Heartbeat still, strong," Nurse Sullivan called out. 145. 148. Good, good. Baby's responding well. Dr. Hayes' face was intense with concentration. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the warmth of the room. His hands moved with practiced precision, pushing here, guiding there, the feeling for the baby's position through layers of skin and muscle and amniotic fluid. "Almost there," he muttered. "Almost, just a little more." Haruka screamed. The pain had reached a crescendo, her entire body rigid with it. And then she felt it. A strange shifting sensation inside her, like something heavy rolling over. Like the baby was somersaulting, tumbling, obeying the pressure of Dr. Hayes' hands. There, Dr. Hayes set his hands still, gently resting on her belly. Head down. "We did it." He placed his stethoscope on Haruka's abdomen and listened. Thump, 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 thump. Fast. Strong, healthy. "The baby's fine," he announced, smiling for the first time since the procedure began. "Better than fine, strong heartbeat, good position. Haruka, you did beautifully. The baby is in the correct position now. You have a much better chance of a safe delivery." Emiko translated, tears streaming down her face. Relief so powerful it felt like drowning. Haruka was crying too. From pain. From relief. From the overwhelming realization that this American doctor had just spent an hour fighting for her baby's life, had risked causing a medical emergency, had put his reputation, his career, everything on the line. For a Japanese prisoner's baby. For an enemy's child. Outside in the hallway, they heard cheering. Miyuki, Tomoe, Sachiko. They'd heard Dr. Hayes' announcement through the door. When Haruka was finally wheeled out of the procedure room, moving slowly, still in pain, but alive, her friends surrounded her, touching her hands, her face, her belly, where the baby now lay, head down, ready to be born the right way. The baby, Sachiko asked urgently, "Is the baby okay?" "Head down," Emiko said, smiling through tears, "ready to be born." The relief was palpable, physical, like a weight lifting. That night back in the barracks, the women sat around Haruka's bunk in silence. Not the tense, frightened silence of before, but something different. Something that felt almost like peace. "I don't understand them," Miyuki finally said. "Dr. Hayes spent an hour trying to turn your baby. An hour of his time, his expertise, for an enemy's child." Why Emiko had asked Dr. Hayes that exact question after the procedure. She'd stumbled through her broken English, trying to find words for the confusion in her heart. His answer had been simple, because that's what doctors do. We fight for life, every life, even lives that belong to people we're supposed to hate. Tomoe folded her hands in her lap. Have you noticed the guards don't look at us with hatred? Dr. Hayes doesn't. Nurse Sullivan doesn't. Even Captain Brennan, when he came to the hospital during the preeclampsia crisis, he looked worried. Actually worried, for Haruka. Maybe Sachiko said slowly they never hated us. Maybe that was only propaganda. Maybe they see us the way Dr. Hayes sees Haruka. As people who need help, not as enemies who deserve punishment. Fumiko, who'd been silent, finally spoke. Her voice was rough, uncomfortable with what she was about to admit. If that's true, then what does that make us? We were taught to hate them. We were taught that surrender was shameful, that prisoners deserved nothing, that the individual doesn't matter, only the state. But she gestured toward the hospital, toward the camp beyond. They believed the opposite, and they won the war. The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Maybe the Americans won because their way was better. Nobody said it out loud, but they all thought it. The week after the procedure, Haruka rested. The baby stayed head down as if understanding that cooperation meant survival. Her blood pressure remained stable. The preeclampsia had resolved. For the first time in months, there was hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. Nurse Margaret Sullivan taught prenatal classes in the hospital. It was something she'd started doing specifically for Haruka, preparing her for what was coming. She demonstrated breathing techniques. In through the nose, out through the mouth, long breaths during contractions, short breaths during the urge to push. She showed positions for labor. Squatting, which uses gravity to help the baby descend. Side lying, which can slow down labor if it's progressing too fast. Hands and hinges, which can help rotate a baby that's positioned incorrectly. She explained what to expect. First stage can last hours, even days for a first baby. You'll feel contractions getting stronger, closer together. When they are 5 minutes apart, lasting a minute each for an hour, that's when you come to the hospital. Second stage is pushing. That's when the baby comes. And third stage is delivering the placenta. Emiko attended every class, taking notes in Japanese, memorizing English medical terms, preparing herself to be Haruka's advocate, her voice, her protector during the most vulnerable moment of her life. The other women prepared too. Sachiko washed and re-washed the baby clothes from Mrs. O'Connor until they were soft as clouds. Miyuki folded tiny diapers made from cut-up sheets, edges carefully hemmed. Tomoe organized supplies in a small wooden box. Blankets, towels, soap, everything a newborn might need. They were preparing for the birth as if it were a communal event, a shared responsibility, because in many ways it was. This baby belonged to all of them now. This baby that represented survival hope, the possibility that enemies could become something else, something human. 5 days before Haruka's due date, Danny O'Connor brought one more package. His face was red again, that mixture of cold and embarrassment that made him look even younger than 19. From my mom, he said, his Japanese much improved now after months of practice. Special for baby. Inside was another hand-knitted blanket. This one was white with yellow and pink trim, the edges scalloped with such precision it must have taken weeks to complete. And a letter. Lieutenant Chen translated, her voice soft. Dear Haruka, I've been praying for you every night since Danny first told me about you. I made this blanket special for your baby. When you wrap your child in it, know that an American grandmother across the ocean is sending you love. I don't know what the future holds for you. I don't know if you'll be able to stay with your baby or if they'll take the child away. I don't know if you'll face hardship when you return to Japan. But I want you to know this. You are not my enemy. You are a mother just like me. You carried a baby under impossible circumstances. You survived when you could have given up. You trusted American doctors to help you when you had every reason to believe they wouldn't. That takes courage I can't even imagine. I hope one day our countries can be friends again. I hope one day our children and grandchildren will meet without hatred. Until then, I'm sending you a grandmother's blessing. May your baby be healthy. May your heart be strong. May you both survive this winter and see many springs. God bless you. Margaret O'Connor. Haruka clutched the blanket to her chest, sobbing. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place beyond words. Because this letter from a woman in Boston who would never meet her, who had no reason to care, who'd spent her evenings knitting for a baby she'd never hold, This was proof that everything they'd been taught was wrong. The enemy wasn't evil. The enemy was just people. People who could choose hatred or choose love. And Mrs. O'Connor had chosen love. "I wish I could meet her," Haruka said through her tears. "I wish I could thank her. Tell her that her kindness saved me in ways medicine never could." Danny, who understood enough now to catch the sentiment, smiled. "My mom, she wants to write to you. After you go home, if you want, I can give you her address." Haruka nodded, unable to speak. Because the idea that an American grandmother would want to correspond with a Japanese prisoner, would want to know about the baby she'd knitted for, would care enough to maintain that connection across an ocean and across the chasm of war, was almost too much to comprehend. December 15th, 1945, 5 o'clock in the morning. Haruka woke with pain radiating across her lower back. At first, she thought it was just another uncomfortable night of late pregnancy. The baby was large now, pushing against her ribs, making sleep difficult. But then the pain came again. Stronger this time, wrapping around her belly like a band of iron, squeezing and releasing. Emiko. The word came out as a whisper, but Emiko was awake immediately, nurse's instincts never sleeping. "Is it time? I think so." Within minutes, the barracks was awake. Women surrounded Haruka, helping her dress, supporting her, as she stood, their faces a mixture of excitement and fear. Someone ran to fetch Dr. Hayes. 5 o'clock in the morning be damned. The doctor arrived within 10 minutes, still buttoning his coat, his hair uncombed. But his eyes were alert, professional, immediately assessing. How far apart are the contractions? Maybe 10 minutes? Emiko estimated, her nursing training overriding her nervousness. "Let's get her to the hospital." Slowly, no rushing, we have time. The walk across the frozen camp was surreal. The sun hadn't risen yet. Stars were still visible in the dark blue sky. The temperature was well below freezing, their breath coming out in thick white clouds. Guards at their posts watched curiously as a group of Japanese women helped their pregnant friend toward the medical building. One guard, not Danny, he was off duty, held the door open for them. "Good luck, ma'am," he said to Haruka, though she didn't understand the words. But she understood the tone, the genuine wish for her safety, for her baby's safety, from an enemy, from a guard, from someone who should want her to suffer but clearly didn't. Inside, everything had been prepared. Dr. Hayes had been planning for this delivery like a military operation, because in a way it was. This birth would either validate everything Camp McCoy stood for or expose it as hollow propaganda. A room had been set aside weeks ago, equipped with everything needed for childbirth. Clean sheets, sterilized instruments, medications, monitoring equipment. Nurse Sullivan was already there along with 2 other nurses. They helped Haruka onto the bed, covered her with warm blankets, began monitoring her vital signs. "Who do you want with you?" Hayes asked through Lieutenant Chen. Haruka looked at her friends. All of them. Emiko, Miyuki, Tomoe, Sachiko. Even Fumiko stood at the back of the group. All of them. "I want them all here." Dr. Hayes smiled. "All right, but they have to wash their hands and follow Nurse Sullivan's instructions. This is still a medical procedure." So they stayed. The 5 women who'd become Haruka's family, who'd hidden her pregnancy on the ship from Manila, who'd formed a human wall around her during that first examination, who'd fought for her, prayed for her, refused to let her face this alone. They washed their hands carefully, put on clean gowns, positioned themselves around Haruka's bed. And the labor began in earnest. The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that redefined what Haruka thought suffering meant. 14 hours of fear that something would go wrong, that the baby would get stuck, that she would die, that her friends would watch her die. But also 14 hours of support, of encouragement, of women refusing to let their friend face this alone. Hour 1 to 3, 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the morning. Contractions 7 to 8 minutes apart. Haruka walked the room, changing positions, trying to manage the pain. Emiko held her hand, coached her breathing. In, out, in, out. Miyuki wiped her forehead with cool cloths. Tomoe whispered encouragement in Japanese. Hour 4 to 6, 9 o'clock in the morning to noon. Contractions 5 minutes apart, more intense. Haruka cried out with each one. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "Yes, you can," Emiko said firmly. "You've survived war, starvation, captivity. You can survive this." Dr. Hayes checked. 5 centimeters dilated. Halfway there, hours 7 to 10, noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Contractions 3 minutes apart. Haruka was exhausted, crying, begging for it to stop. Nurse Sullivan, you're doing amazing. Keep breathing. Dr. Hayes, the baby's heartbeat is strong. Everything is progressing normally. Outside the door, Danny O'Connor paced nervously. He'd come on duty at noon and he couldn't concentrate on anything else. Captain Brennan stopped by, asked for updates, looked genuinely concerned. Word had spread through the camp. The Japanese prisoner was in labor. Everyone was waiting. Hour 11 to 14, 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the evening. Fully dilated. Time to push. Okay, Haruka, Dr. Hayes said, his voice calm but urgent. On the next contraction, I need you to push. Amiko, help her. Everyone else, give her encouragement. We're bringing this baby into the world. 30 minutes of pushing. Haruka screamed, bore down with everything she had. Amiko counted in Japanese and English. Ichi, Nissan, and 2, 3, push, push, push. And then 7:47 in the evening, a cry, loud, angry, alive. Dr. William Hayes caught the baby, a girl small but healthy, her skin pink, her lungs clearly strong, judging by the volume of her cry. A girl, he announced, his voice full of joy. A healthy baby girl. Listen to those lungs. He quickly cleared her airways, checked her reflexes, and then in a moment that would stay with everyone in that room for the rest of their lives, he placed the baby on Haruka's bare chest. Congratulations, he said softly, his eyes wet with tears. She's beautiful. Haruka looked down at her daughter. This tiny life that had somehow survived war captivity, starvation, preeclampsia, breech position, and 14 hours of labor. This baby who'd been born in an enemy prison camp, delivered by enemy doctors, surrounded by enemy nurses. But alive, healthy, perfect. Nurse Sullivan gently cleaned the baby, checked her thoroughly, then wrapped her in the white blanket with yellow and pink trim, the one Mrs. O'Connor had made. She placed the baby back in Haruka's arms. The women crowded around. Emiko, Mayuki, Tomoe, Sachiko, even Fumiko, tears streaming down their faces, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand, her soft hair, her perfect little nose. She's here, Emiko whispered. She's really here. She survived. And Haruka, exhausted, overwhelmed, flooded with more emotions than she could name, looked up at the faces around her, Japanese women who'd become her family. American doctors and nurses who'd saved her baby's life. In that moment, she realized something profound. There were no enemies in this room. There were only people. People who'd cared enough to fight for life. People who'd kept a promise. People who'd shown mercy when they had every reason not to. The enemy had just given her daughter life. And that gift, that single impossible act of kindness, demolished every belief she'd ever held about loyalty, honor, and where the lines between good and evil truly lay. After Haruka had rested, after the baby had nursed for the first time, her tiny mouth finding Haruka's breast with instinctive determination, Dr. Hayes asked the question every new mother hears. What will you name her? Haruka thought for a long moment. She wanted a name from her culture, her language. But she also wanted a name that reflected what this baby represented. Emiko suggested, give her a name that means peace or hope. Something that shows what she represents, not just for you, but for all of us. Haruka looked down at her daughter, swaddled in an American grandmother's blanket, born in an American prison, delivered by American doctors. Nozomi, she said. Her name is Nozomi. It means hope. She looked up at Dr. Hayes. Because she gives me hope that maybe someday the world can be better than this. That people can be better than this. That enemies can remember they're human. Dr. Hayes repeated the name carefully. Nozomi. That's beautiful. Welcome to the world, Nozomi. He reached out and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. She reflexively gripped his finger, that instinctive newborn grasp. And Dr. Hayes smiled, tears running down his face. You know what this grip means, he said. It means she's holding on. She's strong. She's going to be just fine. Haruka remained in the hospital for a week. Standard procedure for all new mothers. The American nurses taught her everything. How to bathe Nozomi, her tiny body slippery with soap. How to change diapers, folding the cloth, just so. How to recognize different cries and what they meant. Hungry cry, tired cry, uncomfortable cry, I need you cry. Nurse Sullivan was especially attentive. She'd show Haruka a technique, then watch as Haruka practiced gently correcting when needed. "You're a natural," Sullivan said one day watching Haruka soothe a fussy Nozomi. "Your baby is lucky to have you. Lucky." The word struck Haruka as strange. Lucky to be born in a prison camp. Lucky to have an uncertain future. But then she thought about Dr. Hayes staying up for 14 hours to deliver Nozomi safely, about Nurse Sullivan teaching her how to be a mother, about Captain Brennan breaking orders to keep her in the camp, about Danny bringing gifts from his mother, about Mrs. O'Connor knitting blankets for an enemy's baby. Maybe Nozomi was lucky, because she'd been born surrounded by people who chose mercy over hatred, who chose humanity over propaganda, who chose life over indifference. Yes, maybe that was the luckiest thing of all. 6 months after Nozomi's birth, June 1946, the orders finally came. The women at Camp McCoy would be repatriated to Japan. Ships were being prepared. They would leave within the month. The announcement brought mixed emotions. Relief at finally going home, fear of what they would find there, anxiety about how they would explain their experiences, and for Haruka, terror about what would happen to Nozomi in a Japan that might reject them both. 1 week before departure, Dr. Hayes called Haruka to his office. On his desk was a thick envelope. "I want you to have this," he said, handing it to her. Inside were detailed medical records. Everything about her pregnancy, Nozomi's birth, the baby's health checks, vaccinations. Pages and pages of documentation. "Take these with you," Dr. Hayes instructed. "Find a good doctor in Japan and give them these records. Nozomi will need continued care, especially in her first year. Make sure whoever treats her knows her medical history." There was also a letter written in English with a Japanese translation attached. Haruka read the translation, tears streaming down her face. "To whom it may concern." This letter certifies that Haruka Tanaka, prisoner of war at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, received proper medical care during her pregnancy according to the standards of the Geneva Convention. Her daughter Nozomi Tanaka was delivered on December 15, 1945, in a medically supervised birth. Both mother and child are healthy. Nozomi is a normal, healthy infant who deserves every chance at a full life. Any suggestion that she is tainted or abnormal due to her birth circumstances is medically unfounded. Signed, Dr. William Hayes, Chief Medical Officer, Camp McCoy. Captain Richard Brennan, Camp Commander. "Why?" Haruka asked, clutching the papers. "Why are you giving me this? Why did you help so much, Doctor?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you're a patient who trusted me with her care. Because Nozomi is a baby who deserved a chance at life. Because treating people with dignity isn't conditional on nationality or circumstance. It's just the right thing to do." He paused, then added, "And because, maybe, just maybe, if enough people on both sides remember that our enemies are human too, we won't repeat the mistakes that led to this war. Maybe your daughter's generation will do better than ours did." Haruka bowed deeply, the formal Japanese bow of profound respect and gratitude. "I will tell her about you," she said. "I will tell her about everyone here, about the mercy you showed when you could have shown cruelty, about the promises you kept, about the enemy who became something else." Dr. Hayes reached out and gently touched Nozomi's head. The baby was 6 months old now, alert and curious, looking at the world with wide, dark eyes. "Take care of her. And take care of yourself. You're both strong. You'll be fine." The day of departure arrived, July 12, 1946. The women boarded buses that would take them to San Francisco, then on to ships bound for Japan. At the camp gates, a small group had gathered to see them off. Dr. Hayes, Nurse Sullivan, Captain Brennan, Danny O'Connor, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a dozen other staff members who'd come to know these women over the past 9 months. Danny approached Haruka holding one final package. "From my mom," he said, his Japanese fluent now after months of study. Inside were more clothes, more diapers, and a letter. "Dear Haruka and Nozomi, I've been praying for you every day since Danny told me about you. I hope Japan treats you kindly. I hope the war ends in people's hearts, not just on paper. If you ever need anything, if you ever want to write, Danny will make sure the letters reach me. You are not my enemy. You are a mother just like me, and that makes us sisters. May God bless you both." Margaret O'Connor. "Tell your mother," Haruka said, her voice breaking. "Tell her a Japanese mother will never forget an American grandmother's kindness." Dr. Hayes stepped forward and handed Haruka one more item. A photograph. It showed him holding Nozomi just after birth, the baby wrapped in Mrs. O'Connor's blanket, tiny and perfect. So she'll know he said what she looked like when she first entered this world. And who was there to welcome her? The women Haruka, Imiko, Miyuki, Tomoe, Sachiko, even Fumiko stood together one last time looking at Camp McCoy, the place they'd arrived at in terror, the place that had changed everything they believed. I was wrong, Fumiko said quietly. About them. About everything. We were all wrong, Emiko replied. But now we know better, and that's something we carry home with us. The buses pulled away, carrying them toward ships, toward home, toward an uncertain future. But Haruka clutched Nozomi close, the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest, and whispered a promise. I'll tell you everything. About Dr. Hayes, who saved your life. About Nurse Sullivan, who taught me to be your mother. About Captain Brennan, who broke rules to protect us. About Danny, who brought you clothes. About his mother, who knitted for you without ever seeing you. I'll tell you that in the darkest time, enemies showed mercy, and that mercy changed everything. And maybe little Nozomi, maybe your generation will remember. Maybe you'll build bridges where we built walls. Maybe you'll choose peace where we chose war. Because you are hope. You are proof that humanity can survive even hatred. And that's the greatest gift anyone ever gave us.